The theme for Lent this year, to which the clergy and residents are trying to remain faithful, is the road less traveled. And I have decided that we're going to do something different today, and that we're going to remember a road that was less traveled in the fantasy world of Hollywood, and we're going to talk about the Yellow Brick Road. Now, that may sound odd to you when we're talking about totalitarianism, freedom, and the church. If you bear with me, you will hear something of that. But before I do that, I want to share with you an experience I had when I was preparing for today, and that is, as I was writing the call to worship and concluded it, I thought to myself, well, that really says everything I wanted to say about totalitarianism, freedom, and the church. So I don't want to just pass over that. Rick has already read it to you once, but I want you to really hear it now as part of the sermon, what the call to worship says. And really listen to the words, because, as I said before, I thought, well, why don't I just quit there and let that be the sermon? So hear it. At a time when millions of people weep in pain as they suffer in a war that dims the flame of life. At a time when innocents are killed and cities are reduced to rubble, while leaders speak of nationalistic glory. At a time when racism and bigotry come to expression in a way that makes manifest a darkness and ignorance that denies the worth of persons. At a time when truth and justice are sacrificed on the altar of falsehood for the sake of distortion and lies, we, the church, come together to affirm that love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things. We come together to be the church at worship, affirming that love never ends. Now, that for me is the message of the church. In a world torn by war, torn by strife, led by ignorance, avoidance of truth, distortion and lies, that's the message of the church. That the church stands for love. And so we affirm that God is love, and that those who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. And so the scripture for today would come from Paul's letter to the Ephesians, when he simply reminds them of who they are by saying, I therefore, the prisoner in the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Now, at a time when our minds are filled with the images of bombed out cities, of unjustified invasions, of children being killed and children's hospitals being bombed. Let this message remind us to remain true to the calling to which we have been called. Being patient and bearing with one another in love. Making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit for all persons in the bond of peace. Amen. So what about the yellow brick road? It will always be that The Wizard of Oz will rank as one of my favorite movies of all time. It was filmed before I was born. It was filmed in 1939. It was the first movie, in case you don't remember, that showed Technicolor when Dorothy lands in Oz, and all of a sudden the black and white film becomes Technicolor, and that was a big deal. And it incidentally did not win the Academy Award that year. It was up for the Academy Award, did not win the Academy Award, because it was up against another movie that just happened to come along the same year called Gone with the Wind. And so it lost out. But its music lived on, and Judy Garland virtually made a career out of Over the Rainbow. But I want us to look at the Wizard of Oz story, the story of Dorothy and her companions, through a theological lens. Because one reason is one of my favorite movies is because I think it makes some of the most important theological statements that any movie has ever made. And I think that just gets lost in our viewing of the movie and our familiarity with it. And I want you to listen for the sounds of totalitarianism, quest for freedom, and the church in the story of Dorothy and her dog Toto, and how this story, this unfolding drama, begins to call into question all sorts of things that speak to us even here, even now, as the church. Now, one of the main characters in the story is Dorothy Gale. Most people don't even remember what her last name was. It's Dorothy Gale. She's an orphan girl who's living with her Aunt Em and her Uncle Henry on a farm, a small dirt farm in Kansas. Dorothy can be characterized as a young woman who is bored. Dirt farm in Kansas is not the most exciting place to be. Looking for some meaning, takes for granted most of the things around her, including the people. Loves her Auntie Em. Uncle Henry doesn't get a lot of coverage, but you assume she sort of loves him too. But not at the deepest level. She's a girl. She hasn't thought through all of the depth of what it means to relate at the deepest levels of openness and honesty and intimacy and caring and appreciation and valuing. She's not there yet. But she does love Toto, her dog, who evidently came with her out of her being an orphan. She is very attached to Toto, and Toto is very attached to her. And the rich woman of the town is angry with her, if you recall the story, because Toto was running through her garden. And so the rich woman of the town claims that she's going to sue because of Toto's damage to her garden, and sue for the entire farm that Auntie Em and Uncle Henry own, because the rich are here and the poor are here, and her garden, in her mind, is worth more than their whole farm. So it seems fair to her that she can sue them for the whole farm because Toto may have done some damage to her garden. So she's entitled and feels superior and lacks any kind of compassion for the poor little farmers that surround her estate. And so she threatens to take the dog, kill the dog, sue the family for the farm, and take the farm as well. Now that's the backstory to what happens in Oz, and most people forget that. They go right to the story of Oz. So Dorothy decides she's going to run away with her beloved Toto so that the mean rich woman can't take Toto and take the farm. And while she's running away, the clouds in Kansas become stormy, and a tornado begins to appear. And Dorothy and Toto try to get back to the farm but don't make it. And Dorothy and Toto get delivered. They make it to the house, but get delivered to the house while everyone else in Kansas is in a tornado storm cellar. And the house itself is lifted into the air and dropped in Oz. Now later on you realize that none of this is actually happening, but it's all part of a dream, nightmare sort of trance that Dorothy's in because she suffers some kind of minor concussion, and she's actually, after the tornado, in the bed with all the farmhands around her, waiting for her to come back to consciousness. So all this is really taking place while Dorothy's safe in bed in Kansas with a mild concussion. But to Dorothy, it's all very real. So Dorothy's house lands on top of the sister of the Wicked Witch of the West. And the sister of the Wicked Witch of the West had these ruby slippers on that the Wicked Witch of the West always envied and wanted. But Glinda, who is the beautiful good witch of the North, comes in and gives the ruby slippers to Dorothy. And Dorothy can't take them off. And it's Glinda who sets up the conflict. She's supposed to be the good witch, but she sets up the conflict because now Dorothy, with no consultation, is given the ruby slippers. And the Wicked Witch of the West, who has always envied and wanted them, is angry at Dorothy, who had nothing to do with the slippers being on her feet. But the Wicked Witch of the West has a totalitarian claim over most of the people because she invokes fear wherever she goes. And she has her army of flying monkeys who are enforcing her will on anyone that she wants to attack. And so Dorothy needs help. And Glinda reminds her that she can go on the road less traveled, the yellow brick road that will take her all the way to the Emerald City, where she will find the great and wonderful Wizard of Oz, who can help her with her dilemma. And so she begins on her trip with Toto, knowing that the Wicked Witch of the West wants to do her harm, but knowing that the great and wonderful wizard, it has been promised to her, can solve her problem. And on the road, she meets the main characters. The Scarecrow, who's just, literally speaking, hanging around in the cornfield, doing nothing because he thinks he has no brain. He's a scarecrow. But he can speak to Dorothy. totally unaware of his ability to communicate, he can speak to Dorothy. And Dorothy asks what she can do to help him. She's the Samaritan on the road. What she can do to help him. And he says, well, you can take me, first of all, off this big stake because the crows aren't even afraid of me anymore. And secondly, you can take me with you because if this great and wonderful wizard can solve your problem, maybe the great and wonderful wizard can solve mine, and he can give me a brain. Okay. So now the Scarecrow, in quest of a brain, intelligence, and Dorothy, in quest of resolution of her issues and a way to find home, travel on the yellow brick road, and they come across a Tin Man who was caught in the rain and who can't move, and he's stuck. And Dorothy, the Good Samaritan, asks Tin Man, what can I do for you? He said, well, you can oil me and you can free me. And she does. And the Tin Man joins her, and he says, well, you know, if this great and wonderful wizard can solve your problem, can solve the Scarecrow's problem, maybe he can solve my problem, because I don't have a heart. I'm a Tin Man, but I don't have a heart. I'm lacking compassion. I'm lacking feeling. I don't have a heart. Can he give me a heart? And she says, well, we'll see. They continue on, and they're confronted with a lion whose false bravado tries to tell them that I'm a big and powerful lion, and I'm this courageous, strong lion, but frankly, he's a wimp. He's the cowardly lion. And they expose him for his cowardice. They expose him for his lack of self-esteem. They expose him for all of this. And he says, well, can you take me with you? Because maybe this great and wonderful wizard can help me with my problem, because my problem is that I need courage and strength. He said, well, we'll see. Let's go. And so Dorothy, Toto, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion head to Emerald City. Now, I won't take you through the whole drama, but they have all sorts of problems. The Wicked Witch tries to stop them. The Wicked Witch tries to destroy them, but they're always able to get by. And they finally make it to the Emerald City. And they think, we're here. We're going to see the wonderful Wizard of Oz. And they go up to where the Wizard of Oz resides in the great cathedral, castle, whatever you want to call it. And the wonderful wizard, Scared, who is the wizard himself disguised as a guard, says to them, you can't come in. No one ever sees the wizard. No one ever gets to see the great and wonderful wizard. He is the Wizard of Oz. But Dorothy's insistent. And finally talks her way into the great castle, the great temple, if you will, of the Wizard of Oz. And they confront the wizard, not personally, but in a great film that reminds us of Zoom meetings, a great screen where the wizard is threatening them and say, how dare you come to the Wizard of Oz? Do you not know who I am? You know, why do you not bow down before me? And Toto goes over and pulls back a curtain where you see a little man with all the microphones and everything trying to shout to pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But Toto has exposed him, and Dorothy and the Tin Man and the Scarecrow and the Cowardly Lion all see that the Wizard of Oz is actually just a man pretending to be a wizard, with all the people believing that he is the great and wonderful Oz. Confronted with truth and freed by truth, we discover that the Wizard of Oz is just a balloonist from Omaha who got blown off course, landed in Oz, And because the people saw him coming from on high and descending to earth, the man from the sky descends to earth. He must be the wonderful wizard, the magic one. And so they say, well, if you're just a man, why can you help us? You're not the wizard. Nothing about you. It's a wizard. He says, well, take a look at what you've done. First, you've had the courage to come here. Second, through all sorts of trials and tribulations, including having to kill the wicked witch of the West, who melts when you baptize her with water. You've made it here this far because you were together, because you took care of one another, because you stood by one another. When one of you was in trouble, you were there for each other. When one of you was able to come up with a good idea, you followed it, you dialogued, you listened, you responded, and you made it this far. And the Scarecrow says, but you can't give me a brain. And now, the wizard, who is really just a balloonist off course, says to him, think of what you have done. Think of how you have helped your friends with your thoughts, with your insights, with your plans, with your abilities, with your intellectual abilities, with your caring. Look what you've done. You have a brain. You already have what you thought you didn't. And so he gives him a certificate. He says, here's a certificate that certifies you've got a brain. Does that help you? Like a diploma? Does that help you? Now you got this thing that says, okay, you're smart. But you're already smart. Tin Man says, but I don't have a heart. He said, look at what you've done. You have loved these people. You have stood by these people. You have been willing to sacrifice yourself for these people. You have confronted evil to defend these people. Of course you have a heart. But here, little clock in the form of a heart, see it ticks and everything. If I give you this, maybe that'll make you feel better. Here's your heart. But you already had a heart. And the lion says, yes, but I still don't have the courage. You can't give me courage. He says, look at what you've done. You faced all sorts of trials and tribulations. You faced even the threat of death, and you've stood by Dorothy and your friends, and you stood by them with the greatest courage one can have. Here's a medal. I'll give you a medal. Does that make you feel like you've had courage now? And so, yeah, they're proud of their certificate, and they're proud of their clock that's a heart, and they're proud of their medal, but they've learned a lesson that the Singing Group America once said, Oz didn't give nothing to the Tin Man he didn't already have. And they suddenly realized that their journey, thinking that someone else could give them the value that they didn't think they had, was a value they already had but did not recognize. Now go back to the curtain. The great and wonderful wizard was seen as almost a god to the people of the Emerald City. Someone who came from the sky, not from the earth. Now, do you remember at the crucifixion of Jesus what happened? The curtain in the temple was torn, and everything was exposed. So in the tearing of the curtain, or the pulling back of the curtain, we see the God of the Emerald City for who he is. Almost like Jesus saying, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father. When you look for God, you look for another person. And interestingly enough, and what had been seen as this totalitarian rule by the Emeralds, the Emerald City by the Wizard of Oz, becomes a response from someone who actually has compassion within himself. And he begins to understand that I don't need to pretend anymore. I don't need to act like I'm the Wizard of Oz. I get to be freed thanks to Toto's exposing me by pulling back the curtain. I get to really be me. And when I freed myself to be me, instead of always pretending to be the wizard, then I become a servant of reconciliation to those who turn to me. I reconcile the Scarecrow to himself and help him understand the insights that he has and the understanding he has and the intelligence he has. And I reconcile the Tin Man to himself and so that he can recognize the compassion he has and the heart that he has. And I reconcile the Cowardly Lion to himself and help him see that he has the courage to be. He has the strength of purpose. I reconcile Dorothy to herself so she's no longer someone who is upset about how boring Kansas is, because she's discovered how meaningful relationships are. And I've reconciled myself to me, because I no longer pretend. And so I've moved from totalitarianism to freedom. I'm free to be me, openly, honestly, authentically, without fear, without frustration, without hesitation. I'm me, a guy from Omaha, but a guy who can help other people see themselves for who they are in their preciousness. A guy who can help other people see themselves for who they are in their wonderfulness. A guy who can help people understand what they have within them that makes them so valuable and precious. And so Emerald City does not have to be ruled by a totalitarian who pretends that he knows more than all of them combined, who pretends that he's something superior to who all of them are. No, this Emerald City can now be ruled by real persons. A scarecrow with wisdom, a tin man with a heart, and a lion with the courage to be. And so suddenly, we move from totalitarianism to freedom and democracy. And we have these three people being among the people, not held away in the temple with guards at the door, but moving and having their being among the people who now move and have their being in the joy of freedom. And so Dorothy and the balloonist get into his balloon, fly back to Kansas, where she has found meaning and relatedness. And all the workmen who worked on the farm, who were the same characters that played the three with her, and Auntie Em and Uncle Henry, are experienced for who they are. People who have always loved her, people who have always cared about her, people who have always treasured her, people who would always be there with and for her. Now that's the message of the church, and that's the message we're seeing on television every night. The Ukrainians are saying, you can bomb our cities. You can kill our people. But But we love our country, we love each other, we're going to stand. You can't take from us who we are. And so we're watching a totalitarian government fail in its attempt, literally fail in its attempt, to ever conquer a people who are people of the heart, who are people who will stand by one another, who will risk their lives for one another, and risk their lives for that which they love. This fledgling little democracy standing right next to a totalitarian government. And that's what scares them. That's what scares Putin. That they're succeeding in a democracy, and that I can't have my people see. I can't let them see that the great and wonderful wizard of Putin is not the one who can control them and guide them where they need to be. And now what do I have to do? I have to cut off all communication. I have to shut down all free broadcasts. I have to make sure that only state messages get through. And even then, courageous people stand up with their signs and say, this is not true. Even now, thousands of Russians are in prisons because more and more the curtain is being pulled back by the totos of the world, and a totalitarian leader is being exposed for who he is, and more importantly, who he is not. So from a theological perspective, and from a political perspective, and from a sociological perspective, from a historical perspective, the Wizard of Oz has a lot to say to us. A lot to say to us. Now, one last thing. Notice what the three people wanted. Intelligence, wisdom, a heart, compassion, courage to be, presence. What are the three great characteristics of traditional theology's view of God? Wisdom, ultimate wisdom, omniscience, ultimate power, omnipotence, ultimate love, omnibenevolence, omnipresence. What we see in that story is what the story of the church is all about. Let us be with one another. Let us love one another. Let us stand by one another. Let us see one another as precious. Let us be willing to be servants to one another, washing of the feet. Let us be willing to stand with and for in love. Let us speak truth to one another in love. Let love inform what we do with one another. Let our appreciation for one another cause us to listen to one another. Love is patient, love is kind, it's not arrogant, it's not rude, it does not insist on its own way, it does not rejoice in wrong, but rejoice in the right. That's the message of the church. So, let's listen to Paul tell us again. Lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. May it be so.